The Kingdom of Solmira had long forgotten warmth. For as far back as the bards could sing, winter had gripped the land with an unyielding fist. Snow blanketed the fields, rivers lay trapped beneath thick plates of ice, and the sun seemed a distant memory, no brighter than a pale lantern in the leaden sky. The people lived in silence, their hopes sealed beneath layers of frost. Among them, Princess Liora bore the weight of their despair. She moved through the castle halls like a ghost, her footsteps echoing in chambers too large for comfort, too cold for laughter. Her father, the king, once a beacon of courage, had retreated into his throne, his voice an empty echo. Her people too had grown hollow-eyed, their spirits as brittle as the frozen earth beneath their feet. One evening, when the moon hung heavy and low, Liora found herself drawn to the forest beyond the castle walls. Her breath clouded the air, each step crunching against the snow as if breaking through a fragile barrier between the known and the unseen. The forest loomed before her, its trees bare and skeletal, their gnarled branches reaching skyward like mourners in prayer. Yet something about it called to her, a pull she couldn't explain, a whisper at the edge of hearing. As she ventured deeper, the icy air seemed to grow warmer, almost tender. The trees thickened, their stark barrenness giving way to a peculiar vibrancy. Then she saw it, a single evergreen, standing tall in the center of a grove, its needles untouched by frost. Its branches, full and verdant, glistened as though dusted with stars. Liora froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tree seemed to hum, a vibration not felt but heard, like the resonance of a deep bell carried through the marrow of her bones. It was unlike any tree she had ever seen, not merely alive but vivid. The snow at its base was pristine, untouched even by the wind, and the air around it was imbued with a strange glow, faint yet unyielding. Liora's pulse quickened, but she dared not step closer. A voice drifted through the stillness, soft as a sigh, yet resonant with power. "What do you seek, child of sorrow?" Liora's heart leapt, her gaze darting around for the source. But there was no one, no figure hidden among the trees, no shadow against the moonlight. The voice seemed to emanate from the tree itself, or perhaps from the air around it, as though the forest itself was speaking. She swallowed, her voice trembling as she spoke. I seek what my people have lost. Hope, love, peace. The voice paused, and in that moment, the grove felt alive with intent. Every needle, every branch trembling faintly as though moved by some invisible wind. "Hope cannot be found. It must be grown," the voice replied. "Return at the first moonrise of the new year. If your heart remains pure, I shall bear gifts, not for you alone, but for all who dwell in shadow." Liora stood transfixed, her breath forming soft clouds that hung in the enchanted air. The tree glowed brighter for a fleeting moment. then dimmed to a steady shimmer. The forest around her seemed to exhale, releasing her from its mysterious grasp. When she finally turned to leave, the journey back felt lighter, her heart stirring with the faintest glimmer of what she dared not name. Back in the castle, the cold stone walls no longer seemed as oppressive. She couldn't explain it, but the thought of the tree, its mysterious voice, its promises, kindled a small warmth within her. For the first time in years, she felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. Little did she know, the evergreen was not simply a... She made her way toward the forest, her footsteps hurried but careful. The moon had risen high by the time she reached the grove. The evergreen stood as it had before, untouched by frost, its branches aglow with an ethereal light. But this time, the tree seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive with anticipation. Liora approached cautiously, her breath visible in the cold air. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, unsure if she should step closer. "Do not fear," the voice whispered, softer this time, almost tender. "You have come as you were meant to." The words seemed to settle over her like a warm blanket, easing the tension in her shoulders. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the pristine snow. The tree shimmered more brightly as she drew near, its light casting long shadows that danced across the grove. "What must I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing more than what you already are," the tree replied. "You have carried sorrow but not bitterness, endured darkness, yet not forgotten the light. For this, the gifts shall come." Liora's eyes widened as the tree's branches began to shift, their movements deliberate and graceful. Small shapes began to form at the tips of the boughs, growing and solidifying as though woven from the air itself. She gasped as the shapes became clear. Delicate ornaments, each one unique and luminous, as though made of spun glass and starlight. They swayed gently, catching the moonlight and casting it into 1,000 tiny beams. "Gifts of the soul," the voice murmured. "Each holds a fragment of hope, love, or unity. They will heal the hearts of your people, but they must be shared freely. No hand can take them in greed, for they will shatter under false intent." Liora stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she reached for the nearest ornament. It was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly with a life of its own. An inscription appeared on its surface, written in a language she somehow understood. Hope. As she held it, a wave of warmth surged through her, chasing away the lingering chill that had clung to her since her earliest memories. She felt a lightness, as though a great weight had been lifted, not just from her, but from the very air around her. She carefully gathered the other ornaments, their inscriptions glowing faintly. Love, unity, courage, and others she could not yet decipher. Each one filled her with a sense of purpose, a certainty that these were no mere baubles, but the very essence of renewal. You must return to your kingdom before dawn, the tree instructed. Hang the gifts high, where all may see. Their light will spread across the land, carrying what your people have forgotten. But then, as the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, the ornaments came alive, their glow spreading outward like ripples in a still pond. The light cascaded over the kingdom, seeping into the shadows of every street and alley, spilling over the frozen fields and into the hearts of Solmira's people. Liora watched, breathless, as the light seemed to melt the despair that had hung over her home for so long. Far below, the first sounds of laughter broke the dawn. A child's voice rang out, clear and bright, followed by another, then another. Doors creaked open, villagers stepping out into the frost to marvel at the sky, which now shimmered with hues of gold and rose. The light had worked its magic. For the first time in years, Solmira's people felt the weight of their sorrow lift. They embraced one another, old feuds forgotten in the face of this strange, miraculous warmth. Farmers walked their fields, marveling as the frost began to retreat, revealing soil that had lain dormant for decades. Liora descended the tower, her heart light yet solemn. She wandered through the village, her presence unnoticed amid the jubilation. The gifts had done what they were meant to do, but she could not shake the lingering words of the evergreen. Hope and love require tending. Her path led her to the village square, where an old woman sat on a weathered bench, gazing at the sky. Her face was lined with years of hardship, but her eyes shone with a quiet wonder. Liora approached, hesitating before speaking. "Do you feel it too?" she asked softly. The woman turned to her, smiling faintly. "Aye, child. It's as if the cold has finally loosened its grip on us. But tell me, what brought this change?" Liora faltered. It was a gift. "A gift indeed," the woman murmured, her gaze returning to the sky. "But gifts can be fragile things, princess. Even the most radiant light can fade if not cherished." Liora's breath caught. "How did you know?" But the woman only smiled, rising with a grace that defied her years. "The land knows its guardian, child. It always has." And with that, she vanished into the crowd, leaving Liora to ponder her words. As the day wore on, the village bustled with a newfound energy. Children ran through the streets, their laughter a melody that warmed even the coldest corners. Families gathered around fires, sharing stories of hope renewed. But as twilight fell, a shadow stirred at the edge of the forest. From its depths emerged a figure cloaked in black, her form wreathed in mist that seemed to devour the light. The witch of withered souls had seen the ornaments glow, felt their warmth encroach on the icy tendrils of her curse. She stood at the forest's edge, her eyes fixed on the castle tower where the gifts hung, her lips twisted into a sneer. "Such fleeting light," she hissed, her voice sharp as breaking ice. Let us see how long it endures." She stretched out a withered hand, and the air around her darkened. The trees groaned, their branches heavy with frost. Shadows began to creep from the forest, reaching toward the village like grasping fingers. Liora, standing once more at the tower's peak, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She turned her gaze toward the forest, where the darkness writhed like a living thing. The evergreen's warning echoed in her mind. The path ahead is fraught with shadows. The gifts had brought hope, but now Liora realized the truth. Hope alone would not be enough. The battle was only beginning. Night fell upon Solmira with an unsettling weight, as if the air itself carried a warning. The glow of the ornaments atop the tower seemed fainter now, their light struggling against a darkness that had begun to seep across the horizon. Liora stood at the window of her chamber, her heart tight with unease. From the edge of the forest, the shadows crept closer, spreading like ink spilled upon the snow. At their heart stood a figure cloaked in black, her presence twisting the very air around her. The Witch of Withered Souls had returned, and with her came the chill of despair, a cold that was not of the body, but of the spirit. Liora sensed it before she saw it, a weight pressing against her chest, the first prick of doubt whispering in her mind. What if she was not enough? What if the gifts she had hung so carefully were mere illusions, fragile and fleeting? A sharp knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of the castle stewards, his face pale as he delivered his message. The forest had darkened, the village growing quiet as fear gripped the hearts of the people. The warmth and laughter of the morning seemed a distant memory now, replaced by a creeping unease. Liora knew she had to act. Wrapping herself in her cloak, she ascended the tower once more, her breath catching as she gazed at the ornaments. Their light still flickered, but it was weaker now, as though the very air sought to smother it. A voice cut through the silence, low and venomous, carried on a wind that seemed to rise from nowhere. "Did you truly think it would be so easy?" Liora spun toward the sound, her heart pounding. There on the castle grounds below stood the witch, her form shrouded in mist. Her eyes, pale and cold, locked onto Liora's with an intensity that froze her in place. "The gifts are beautiful, yes," the witch continued, her voice dripping with mockery. "But beauty fades, hope falters, love crumbles, and when they do, my winter shall return, stronger than before." Liora's hands clenched at her sides. "You're wrong," she called out, though her voice wavered. "The gifts have already begun to heal the kingdom. Your curse is breaking." The witch laughed, a sound as hollow as wind through an empty hall. "Foolish girl, hope is fragile. Love is fleeting. All it takes is a whisper of doubt, a touch of despair, and your precious gifts will shatter." The air around her darkened further. the shadows reaching toward the tower like grasping hands. The ornaments swayed in the growing wind, their light flickering dangerously. Liora felt the weight of the witch's words settle over her like a shroud. She turned to the evergreen's gifts, her fingers brushing one of the glowing ornaments. The warmth it radiated was faint now, and for the first time she felt a sliver of fear. Fear that the witch might be right. But then she remembered the grove, the voice of the tree, and the promise it had made. Hope could not be found. It must be grown. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes, blocking out the witch's taunts. She focused instead on the people of Solmira, the child's laughter she had heard that morning, the old woman's smile, the way the frost had begun to thaw. These were not illusions. They were real. When she opened her eyes, her voice was steady. "The light will endure," she said, her words carrying across the wind. "Not because it is perfect, but because it is shared. You cannot extinguish what is carried in every heart." The witch's expression darkened, her form twisting as though the shadows themselves recoiled from Liora's words. With a scream of fury, she thrust her hands toward the tower, and a wave of darkness surged forward, seeking to envelop the ornaments. But as the wave neared, the ornaments flared with sudden brilliance, their light cutting through the shadows like the first rays of dawn. The wave faltered, then dissolved, the darkness retreating as though burned by the light. The witch staggered, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her eyes, once so piercing, now held a flicker of something else, fear, perhaps, or defeat. She let out a final, anguished cry before vanishing into the night, her shadow swallowed by the forest. Liora collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ornaments above her glowed steadily now, their light stronger than ever. Below, the village stirred, the air once again filled with the sound of voices and laughter. But Liora knew the battle was not yet over. The witch's curse had been driven back, but it had not been destroyed. The darkness would return as it always did, and the gifts would need tending, not just by her, but by all who lived in Solmira. Rising to her feet, she gazed out at the kingdom, her resolve hardening like steel. The evergreen's gifts were fragile, yes, but they were also alive, growing stronger with every act of kindness, every moment of courage. And as long as she and her people guarded them, the light would endure. The dawn broke over Solmira, the first true dawn in years. But in the heart of the forest, the shadows lingered, waiting for their time to rise again. The dawn that broke over Solmira carried with it a strange stillness, as if the kingdom itself were holding its breath. The shadows that had gathered in the night seemed to recede, their grasping tendrils retreating to the edges of the forest. But though the village stirred with relief, Liora felt no such peace. From the tower, she gazed down at her people. They laughed, embracing one another as the sun rose higher, its light glinting off the ornaments that still hung above. The gifts shimmered with a renewed radiance, their inscriptions glowing faintly against the pale sky. Yet Liora's heart remained heavy. The witch was gone, but her parting scream echoed in the recesses of her mind, a reminder that this victory was but a reprieve. Her thoughts turned to the evergreen. Its wisdom had guided her this far, but the path ahead felt shrouded in mist. She needed answers, a way to fortify her people against the return of the witch's despair. With renewed determination, she wrapped herself in her cloak and slipped out of the castle once more. The forest greeted her in silence, its icy stillness broken only by the crunch of her boots against the snow. The path to the grove felt longer this time, as if the forest itself resisted her passage. Shadows lingered at the edges of her vision, faint and formless, but she pressed on. When she reached the grove, the evergreen stood as it always had, its needles shimmering faintly. But this time, the air around it felt heavier, as though the tree itself bore the weight of what had transpired. "Evergreen," she called softly, her voice trembling. "I have done as you asked. The gifts have brought light to my people, but the darkness still lingers. How do I ensure the light will last?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then the tree's voice came, softer than before, but no less resonant. "Child of Solmira, you have done well, but the gifts I have given are not mine to sustain. They belong to you, to your people. It is through your hearts that their light endures." Liora frowned, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "But the witch, her curse isn't gone. She will return. How can we fight against her darkness when it feels so strong?" The tree's branches swayed gently, their movements stirring the air. The witch's power does not come from her alone. It is fed by despair, by fear, by the seeds of doubt that grow unnoticed in the hearts of those who have forgotten hope. The darkness is not an enemy to be defeated, but a shadow to be dispelled, and shadows cannot thrive where the light is tended. Liora closed her eyes, the weight of the tree's words settling over her. She thought of her people, of the fear that had gripped them the night before, the way doubt had dimmed the ornaments' light. The gifts had brought hope, but they were not a cure. They were a beginning. She opened her eyes, her resolve solidifying. "Then I must teach them," she said. "Teach them to protect the light, to share it with one another. If despair feeds the darkness, then unity must starve it." The tree's voice was warm, almost approving. "You understand now. The gifts were never meant to last forever. They are sparks, meant to ignite a fire within your people. But the flame must be fed by love, by courage, by acts of kindness and hope. Only then will it endure." As Liora turned to leave, the tree spoke once more. "Remember, child, the light you seek is not mine to give. It is yours to grow. And as long as your heart remains true, the darkness will never claim your kingdom." The journey back to the castle felt lighter this time, as though the forest itself recognized her resolve. When she returned to the tower, the ornaments greeted her with a gentle glow, their light steady and unwavering. In the days that followed, Liora began her work. She gathered the villagers, sharing the story of the evergreen and its gifts. She spoke not of magic, but of the power within each of them to tend the light through their actions, through forgiveness, through compassion, through the small everyday acts that bound them together. The ornaments remained atop the tower, a symbol of the hope they had reclaimed. But over time, they became less important than the traditions that grew around them. Each new year, the people of Solmira would gather to plant seeds in the thawing earth, a reminder that hope, like the evergreen, must be nurtured to grow. And though the shadows of the forest never fully vanished, they no longer held the same power. For as long as the people of Solmira carried the light in their hearts, the darkness could not claim them. In the grove, the evergreen stood as a silent sentinel, its branches swaying gently in the wind. And though its voice was no longer heard, its promise lived on in the hearts of those who had learned to tend the fragile, beautiful gifts of hope and love. The new year had come, and with it, the knowledge that every dawn carries the promise of renewal for those brave enough to protect the light.